Hi, I'm Cody.
I'm Brent.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review for you the best science fiction, and sometimes the worst, books of all time. Today we have Hyperion by Dan Simmons, which was published in 1989 and won the Hugo for Best Novel in 1990. On paper, you can read it in about 482 pages. There it is. The audiobook is 20 hours and 45 minutes long. It's a very entertaining production as well. So what's Hyperion about, Brent?
Yeah, so Hyperion is a space epic in the form of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So Hyperion itself is a colony planet at the edge of Hegemony space and is home to some of the greatest mysteries of the galaxy. There's a network, a labyrinth of underground tunnels that crisscross the entire planet. There's the time tombs, which are these ruins that are surrounded by an anti-entropic field within which time runs backwards. And then there's the Shrike, who's a 3-meter tall, metal, spiked, bladed monster who periodically emerges from the time tombs and murders innocent passerby. And the story follows 7 pilgrims who are traveling to Hyperion from humanity's various portal-connected web worlds and returning to the planet in advance of an alien invasion. And like in Chaucer, the story largely consists of each pilgrim's self-narrated backstory intercut with their return journey to Hyperion and the time tombs.
Yeah, and for me, this book is a 5. It's a masterpiece. It's just this beautiful amalgam of like our own real-world literary history with science fiction tropes, classic science fiction tropes, blended together. And the form, it keeps the plot so moving forward and interesting. Each little pilgrim story is kind of like its own little story with conflict and a plot arc within the broader scale. And the way he marries all these things together and makes it so riveting is phenomenal.
For sure. I agree with all that, but nevertheless, my review is a 4. It is deeply engrossing. The stories will stick with you for many years, at least they have for me. But the broader plot that ties the individual stories together is, in my mind, a little threadbare. And there is kind of no ending, although we'll talk about that later. And it's a little sexist too. That said, I will say this is like one of the best collections of sort of interconnected short stories ever. That said, I'm not sure it makes it like one of the greatest novels ever. So
right, and on that note, as far as short stories, we didn't really find a way to talk about this or organize our podcast other than to talk about each story and get into the details a little bit on each story, and then assess, his themes and the writing and all that stuff we usually talk about within the context of each sub story, since that's so much of the book.
Yeah, for sure. That said, still, as we're just talking about each of these stories, still no spoilers. We're just going to sort of talk about the setup and of each of these stories individually. So no worries. Still no spoilers here.
And who's first?
Yeah, so the first is a disgraced priest, Paul de Rey, who traveled to Hyperion to sort of go into self-imposed exile and to look for this mythical group of people who's supposed to be living on this high plateau protected by the electric Tesla trees and have been living there for thousands of years, sort of as an uncontacted tribe.
The Bakura.
Yeah, and they're kind of like the Lotus Eaters from
the Odyssey,
from Homer. Yeah. Or H.G. Wells, they're basically also Lotus Eaters. I can't remember what they're called in the Time Machine, but
yep.
Yeah, they are very interesting. And then my favorite part of this is this priest is there because he had sort of tried to fabricate some evidence that Christianity was real on a different planet. And then he gets to Hyperion and starts to find this stuff that we won't spoil, but it's maybe starting to suggest that like, oh, is Christianity real? Like, how can this stuff be here and be this old? And like, what is happening with this like pseudo mythical things happening with this tribe?
It's a really like fascinating thought experiment on like the nature of religions and why we create them and whether they are natural law or like, it just from human mind, and where they come from. What's, the fundamental purpose questions, and also deals a lot with the idea of mortality, like a lot of these other stories do. Which brings us to our next one, Our next story is about Colonel Kassad, who is the military character. He's the fighter. One thing that's interesting about all these stories is instead of seeing culture, a subculture, it's all soldiers, it's all academics. We're seeing a really broad swath of characters from a bunch of different backgrounds that gives us an idea and gives Simmons a way to describe the new galaxy he's created, or the Hygira, the humans who left Earth and dispersed, in a really broad sense. And Colonel Kassad is the soldier, and he, throughout his career and some VR Ender's Game type war games, he comes in contact with a woman, Moneta, who he has a lot of sexual encounters with. We'll get to that. But and she shows him the Shrike, the monster that you described earlier.
She sort of guides him to Hyperion, where he meets the Shrike, and sort of he is the character through which we get to experience like what the Shrike is really capable of. And we won't spoil it, but the Shrike is a scary, scary dude. You do not want to meet him.
Right. He can also manipulate time.
Yes, very scary superpowers. And so this story is kind of reminiscent of like Rama from the Hindu Ramayana. He's like on this quest. He's meeting basically gods, becoming like more and more powerful and able to fight more and more powerful forces. And
becomes a god
as with
himself.
Many of these, it's sort of referencing really old classic literature.
And then also exploring the science fiction trope of time trade.
Yes,
like moving backwards and forwards, different characters moving backwards and forwards.
Yeah, this is one of the stories that as I was rereading this book, this is one where I didn't there was nothing in this story that I had like remembered from my first version, but as I was reading through this time, I was like struck. I was like, oh my god, this is like really. It's pretty sexist. There's a lot of like the encounters with him and this woman are like sort of a teenage boy's fantasy of what sex might be like. Like they literally do not speak. She just like sees him, has no clothes on, is like super hot, and he's describing like her nipples in great detail, and she's just like immediately jumping on his dick basically. And it's
you were telling me
not.
you told me you ran into a Reddit thread that was like, I'm reading Hyperion, but I can't read the word areola one more time. And that's fairly accurate.
Yeah, that said, you just have to, there are a lot of redeeming things about this book. This is the worst part for this, for sure. There's some other sort of sexism issues. Move through Colonel Kassad and you'll get out of it.
Yeah, so and I guess in its defense, like the only plausible defense is it fits with his warrior MO, right? It's just like violence and sexuality is like his character, and these two things they go well together, but that's a very weak defense.
Sometimes in reading a book, you're like, oh, this is like a sexist character, but this does not feel like it's like a sexist situation. It's like, show us this thing about society. This did not feel like that. Yeah. This feels like, this is just sexist.
Like a Bujold or something. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not. Yeah, it's not like that. So, but in any case, so that'll take us to the next story, which is the poet Martin Salinas. So Martin grew up on old Earth, on Earth before it was destroyed, and he published a book of poems about the dying Earth, and that was hugely popular, made him stupendously rich, and he kind of had this like decadent, high class lifestyle for a while, and eventually moves to Hyperion to try to sort of write his new magnum opus, and there, as with many of the other characters, sort of encounters the Shrike and the terror of that, and seeing what's happening to the people around him.
Right. And he's got what's interesting about his story is kind of the interjection of Simmons on like the earning potential of the artist versus the false artist. He earns all this money on this one book that's basically just, this is what Earth was like, and he hits this cultural moment, so everyone buys it, but then he can't recreate his success.
No one wants to read the stuff that he thinks is good.
Right.
Yeah.
He's writing the actual deep stuff, so he writes like a series of crappy adventure novels that get made into movies, and that's what makes him money. So there's a whole element of that going on too. But
there was an element in this story though that was one of the things that stuck with me from my first read like 15 years ago that I've had in my head since then. Such an interesting idea. So when he gets stupendously rich, Martin Salinas builds this custom house where all the doorways are these Farcaster portals where you step through them and you're instantly transported to a room on a different planet. So he's got a room with like house with like 40 rooms. All the rooms are in different planets. And the toilet, the bathroom.
Best room. Yeah, the bathroom.
Yeah, it's definitely the best room. Yeah, it's funny because we talked about this. We both were struck by this same image. Like, it's stuck with us since. His bathroom is on a raft just on the middle of this entire ocean planet.
Mare Infinitus.
Mare Infinitus, where it's constantly like storming and squalling, and that's where he does his business. And that's just such a crazy thought and idea that I have just never been able to shake. I really think it's a really creative thing that
mostly
that
just
Simmons
the
thought
idea of like the Farcaster going down and you being stuck on an infinite ocean world on a raft that has a toilet and nothing else. It's a super cool image. And he also represents a lot like the artist, and then we also get to see through him the first time another Simmons' assessment of the value of mortality in this thing they have in the universe called the Poulsen treatments, which are life extending medical procedure.
This poet is like hundreds and hundreds of years old. He's very old.
And a little bit from relativity and a little bit from these treatments, but they kind of make you glow ghoulish and blue. And all the people who have them, it's really expensive. So all the people who have them really just are extending their life to keep living a vapid, pointless existence.
They're like going to the opera and having orgies constantly, but like they're all kind of crazy. And Martin Salinas is certainly kind of crazy. He is hopelessly alcoholic and depressed, as are actually many of the characters in the story. There's not a lot of happy people.
Like every other character except this next character who tells his tale. He's the scholar Sol, and it's a tale about him and his daughter Rachel, who was studying the time tombs as an archaeology grad student, basically. And there's an accident and she gets the Benjamin Button disease. And so she ages backwards in time. And his tale is about Saul trying to find a cure for what they call Merlin's disease and cure her to age normally before she ages out of existence as an infant.
Yeah. And this is another one this is another one of those ideas that stuck with me for many years. He really goes into the detail of what it would be like to wake up every morning and you have all the memories that you should have had that day. You think it is this day from your past, and what would that be like? How would you cope? What are the things that you would try to make for yourself? You can only remember this day. And so what are you going to make for yourself that you could give to yourself tomorrow when you will have forgotten all this again because your memory will be one day younger? It's
right. And do you want to live with that yourself? And it's more particularly about parenting someone who's going through that. So you get the outside perspective and like details like we don't have her favorite clothes from when she was 8 anymore. And she's going to ask for them. And like all of her friends have aged, but she still thinks they're her age. It's a really...
And it's a really interesting exploration, I think, of being a parent with a child with a really serious, potentially terminal illness, but they're still your child. And so you want them to be happy and to experience good things in their life. But it's such it's a really serious position for you to be in as the adult who understands what's happening. And so it's a really humanizing moment with this family.
Yeah. And then next we have a little bit, our fifth tale is a little bit more, you can tell us about Braun Lamia.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so she's the detective. Yeah. And so she's a hard-boiled private eye who's hired by what turns out to be an AI that is living in a human body. And that AI is an attempted recreation of the poet John Keats. So they gave it all of Keats's writing and everything they knew about his life. And so Keats is the writer who wrote Hyperion, this unfinished epic poem this book is named after.
Which, to clarify, John Keats, the real person, wrote a real unfinished epic called Hyperion hundreds of years ago in this world that's about the titans and demigods trying to overthrow the gods of Olympus. And so this book and the planet share a name with that.
And, there's a lot of the similar themes with what's happening here and sort of the meta story. So this short story is kind of like the detective noir, feel, but with a lot of cyberpunk overtones from like the early 90s. There's a lot of it that sort of feels like Snow Crash and
or
William
Gibson.
Yeah, with like the visualization of computer environments, which is interesting. It's part of a time and place, I would say.
Right. in science fiction.
Yeah. There's
the one kind of thing about Bron Lamia's tale is like we finally get a strong female character, but it's not. She's basically just a bro. She's like a strong like machismo male character.
Yeah, she's like literally physically strong, female. And that's what makes her cool. Is she like does a lot of push-ups and beats guys up, and it's like, well, is that what makes women cool? I don't know. Anyway,
yeah, it can be, but it's very like just that. It feels like a male archetype imposed on a female, kind of like the CEO of the Hegemony, the leader of all of the human worlds. Maina Gladstone is a similar like just male leader archetype, but she's
like super manipulative, and so in some ways it's like, oh, it's progressive. He's got like the leader of the world being a woman, but in other ways it's like, oh, but she's being like a horrible manipulative man. And it's so he's like the powerful female characters that he makes, basically he's like giving stereotypical male traits to, and so that's not really how you write strong female characters. So yeah, that is but the AI
core is an interesting trope here. We get to see a little bit more into the AI core and like the who is developed by the humans, but then kind of lives on their own and supports the Farcaster network and the portals. Everything that the humans do is dependent on the AIs, and then we have just the one AI who's bridging the gap, who's a cybrid, the John Keats persona, who's an AI living in a human, like you said.
Yeah. There's one thing, this story in general is not one of like the strongest ones in the book, but there is one image from this that I would call out, because it's another one of those ones that has stuck with me for, the 15-year gap from my first to my second reading. And there's this battle that happens on this industrial planet Lucis, and they're wearing like power armor, and they've got these vision targeting systems, basically, where you can like by looking and thinking, you can like fire and fight. And the ideas there have stuck with me for a really long time. I think it's very much the way, future technology will take us. I just thought that was an interesting thing. It was the first place that there's power armor lots of places, but like this really felt like it like brought it together in a way that felt real.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. And then that's kind of belittling of your point. It's super cool, but it is. It is.
So yeah. So what's our last story?
The final character who tells the story is the Consul, who's the character we begin the entire novel with. We see him before we even start telling the Pilgrim stories. So he's kind of the eyes we see the rest of the happening through. And he's a little more mysterious than the other characters. His story is about his grandparents. It's a love story about his grandparents who met on a planet that was created to have nature preserved, called Maui Covenant. And he is a worker on a construction vessel who's come to Maui Covenant to build the first Farcaster. So anyone in the web worlds can come instantly to and fro. And he meets in a very Romeo and Juliet-like setting, a woman from Maui Covenant, one of the natives, and he begins a relationship with her that spans over many decades, because when the ship goes to pick up since it doesn't have a Farcaster portal, the ship must go back to pick up supplies, and then he comes back, and because of relativity, over like the couple months of his journey, a decade or more has passed. And so it's about his different meetings with this woman, Siri, as she ages and he barely does, and their relationship. And it also has, the big thing here is like value of mortality, explored through,
again, one of the most common themes in the book.
Yeah. And explored from like the nature versus progress perspective, which was obviously we see all the time. The planet Maui Covenant is created to preserve nature, and the rest of humanity wants to bring more people and technology to exploit its resources for vacation homes, all this stuff. And it's about that battle. Also, the Hawking mat.
Yeah, they have a Arabian Night style flying carpet, which is like very cool idea. I don't know, in the future, why not have that?
Yeah, great scientifically explained. Yeah, it's super cool.
Yeah. So what I think the thing that really makes Hyperion unique is this form, right? It's much more than a collection of independent short stories. Like each of them is really amazing, but it's a lot more than that, right?
It's also a commentary on the history of storytelling, oral and written, our real history of storytelling, and science fiction tropes. It's like he's borrowing from a million places and he's jamming these two ideas together in each story. You know, like for example, you have the Bron Lamias, like the cyberpunk meets the classic noir detective story, and brings those together, or the Lotus Eaters meeting the idea of mortality and bringing those together. And so it's also just a masterful commentary on our history of storytelling and the mechanics of that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I also think the mystery is really excellent. It builds up this, you know, there's all these things that sort of don't make sense, and not that they don't make sense, but are sort of like left unexplained intentionally in each of these stories. So it's sort of building up to this like grand idea of like what might happen. Unfortunately, that actually turns into one of my gripes, because I feel like this book is very much not like a standalone book. There is no ending, for sure, in the traditional sense of what an ending is. There is not one. And so I know you, I read Fall of Hyperion, but it's been many years. I know you just recently reread it, so you might have different thoughts on this.
Yeah, because I kind of view it as it's not standalone. I mean, I immediately had to reread Fall of Hyperion, which did not win a Hugo, so I was like, okay, but I read it anyways. Because that's basically all we do now for this podcast is read Hugo winners. But it's really just part one of two. It does not stand. I guess it kind of stands alone, but it's not as satisfying. You're going to immediately want to read Fall of Hyperion. And I think in that context, it's excellent. It's really excellent.
I think just as a general rule, like if you're going to call a book, it should have, you know, a beginning, a middle, and an end. That said, the other thing I'll throw out here, and I'm really saying this with a grain of salt because I haven't read Fall of Hyperion in a long time, but when I read it the first time, I remember still being kind of dissatisfied with the threads not really all coming together. But I'm going to make that a very soft criticism.
Yeah, I did not feel that. Old knowledge. I did not feel that way at all. Fall of Hyperion is a much different book, but also a way worthwhile read, and I thought it was very satisfying conclusion. And wrapped up nicely. I also think that Hyperion itself does have an end. I don't think it's fair to say that it doesn't have an end. It's just that the end is not sad. It's not what you think it, you know.
Well, the book stops. I'll agree with you on that, but that's okay. As far as I'm concerned.
All right. Well, agree to disagree there. Definitely read Hyperion and then read Fall of Hyperion because you're going to want to right after that.
And for sure. So our average rating here is a 4.5. There's a lot to be said about this book. There's a lot of depth. There's a lot of really interesting things happening. So definitely recommend you read it. Push through the sexist moments. It's definitely not, the whole thing. So what are some similar books that we should recommend?
Okay, similar books. The first one I thought of was Sirens of Titan by Vonnegut. And Vonnegut obviously way more silly than Simmons is. Simmons is, messes around with some humor too, but that's not his main point. But it also explores like the kind of ideas of religion and futility of trying to ascribe purpose to things, and the like kind of general what is my purpose questions, the futility of asking those in a really fun narrative.
For sure. Next, I would recommend Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. It explores some similar ideas about sort of the interaction between humanity and artificial intelligence, as well as having sort of a layered story of sort of several different things happening at once, sort of coming together, and is just really, really great, really, really great read. So highly recommend it if you have not.
Yeah. And this next book we also recommended in the Fire Upon the Deep review. So second time recommending it, that means that we really liked it. What is it?
Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie. Yeah, I think about that book all the time. There's a lot of ideas for those who know me really well. You won't be surprised to hear that I love that book. It has so many ideas that I think about all the time, and I was trying to talk about in my book actually. But a lot of interaction between, again, AI and humanity, and cybrids and Yeah, it's great. It's great.
The ideas of what artificial intelligence in a human body or society would be like.
Exactly.
Yeah. So ultimately, Hyperion, I mean, it's one of the classics. So, of course, it's worth a read. We also think it's worth the read.
Yeah. 4.5 stars. We really liked it. I hope you do too. Keep reading, everybody.
All right. See you next time.
Bye.